This is Matthew coming to you in the latest episode of Samsara Audio. This episode felt a bit different from past episodes. It was definitely more of a conversation. My guest, Jonatan Anabalon, he is a middle school teacher from Norway. He has a master's in anthropology from the University of Bergen. He's just a delightful interlocutor that I found online. He joined our Kyoto School reading group, and he's just been a delight to get to know. He wanted to have a conversation to kind of hash through some language and conceptual differences that we found cropping up in our discussions. I really appreciate the way that he listens, he thoughtfully engages with not only what's going on conceptually, but also what's happening behind the scenes in terms of fears and anxieties and the dynamic of a conversation. So I feel extremely lucky to count him as a friend and as a dialogue partner. I hope that you really enjoy this conversation where we tried to get to the root of the differences that we both experience. Me coming from a Hegelian direction, him coming from more of a Neoplatonic direction, and where are the tensions and the contradictions there, and where is the overlap too, where we're trying to get at something similar, where we understand the intuitions. I especially appreciated the way that Jonatan pushed back against kind of this modernist supremacy that I can perhaps instantiate sometimes, and maybe often in the discourse we have this idea that because we are modern we understand things better. I appreciate the way that Jonatan pushes back and kind of calls us back to, yes, we can be critical of the ancients, but maybe there's something there that we are missing when we move too fast, when we're too critical. And so I would say this was a little bit of a couch session, a little bit of a therapy session at a conceptual level. I'm thankful for it, and I hope that it benefits you as much as it did me. Let's dive right in. All right, Jonatan, I'm excited for this conversation. I'm not sure where things are going to go, but you and I have sort of been in conversation for a while. You joined the Kyoto School reading group that we're doing at Samsara Study Groups. I know you've been reading my newsletter, so thank you. I really appreciate that. But I love your story. I love your background. I've really been impressed with your insights and just wanted to talk further kind of what you're thinking about and see if we can both develop each other's thinking. Let's see, where do we want to dive in? I think you brought up the ox herding pictures, and I've been thinking about the ox herding pictures in Zen as well. I presented a paper at a conference on Lacan back in the end of February where I was thinking about this move from the exoteric to the esoteric. How does one make that transition from being exoteric to an esoteric insight? And especially, how do you help other people attain that? I was using psychoanalysis as a way to think about that. And I wanted to get into a psychoanalytic reading of koans as kind of these, almost like a psychoanalytic session between an analyst and their analysand, where one is kind of trying to induce insight in the other person. But I think that as I have been thinking about the paper more, and I'm developing it towards publishing it in the anthology that Philosophy Portal puts together for each of their conferences, I feel like the ox herding pictures might be a better direction to go than the koan necessarily, like at the moment. It kind of has Hegelian flavors to it a little bit, but I'm curious, what has your experience been meditating on the ox herding photos, and how does it connect to your own experience of, I know, working with young people in education and trying to help them learn and have insight? Does it connect to that? Are there other experiences in your life that kind of come to mind for you? I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, first and foremost, I just want to say hello, Matthew, and thank you for talking to me. Really cool to be part of this podcast that I'm actually listening to. It's a little bit surreal. But I have really enjoyed our conversations in the Nishida study group. And I kind of felt that we are coming into the conversation from a different, little bit different angles, but also that there's a lot of overlap. You know, a little bit like the one you kind of feel the most tension with are the ones that are closest to you. Like a brotherly love or whatever, you know. It's really close to you, but not exactly. Unless you are there, but you're using a different word. That's really irritating, or something like that. So I just wanted to. Oh man, I really want just to talk with you and see if there is some fruitful that it feels like a tonus, like a creative tension there. It feels like a place to investigate, to explore. So you were talking about the ox herder. And of course, I guess it's from the Middle Ages, but maybe it has a history way earlier than that. 10 beautiful little paintings or drawings or carvings of a young ox herder trying to catch this animal in the forest, and his kind of journey through the woods and into something that looks like a kind of enlightenment story. So the first thing that I really, really like about this story is that it doesn't end in enlightenment. It doesn't end in the mystic experience or the epiphany. That is kind of I think it's the seventh picture or something. It doesn't end at the peak of the mountain. It ends back down in the city, like just in our ordinary experience again. And for me, that is something that really speaks to me. And I think it speaks to you too, because I've seen in your writings and also in how you're talking about this that it's easy to fetishize the mystic experience as the kind of end of all things. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that we are on the same page there of wanting to end up back in the city, back in the market, back in community with others, not absorbed in some sort of mystical experience. I also really like about the ox herding photos, kind of the early few photos are focused on the preparation of the young man to capture the ox, in symbolizing some sort of enlightenment, some sort of insight. And, first he catches sight of the tracks of the ox, and then he's following the tracks, and then he tries to catch the ox. But then once he's got the ox, he has to tame the ox, and then he's got to lead the ox back home. And so there's all these steps in the process. I'm interested in all of the steps, in how do you teach somebody to catch sight of the tracks of the ox? And maybe even before that, how do you help somebody have the desire to look for the ox? Catching the sight of the tracks of the ox only makes sense when you have the desire to find the ox and that you know what ox tracks look like, for instance. So there's a lot going on there helping people figure that out. But it's so interesting how, as the pictures go on, the ox disappears around like 6, I think. There's just the man and there's no ox, and then there's no man, and then there's nature, and then there's the man back in the market and kind of like happy and jolly, serving other people and that sort of thing. So the way I come at this is kind of from a Hegelian angle, is that in a way he returned to the start, but that he was changed by the journey. And actually that there's kind of like a new journey ahead, that from the point of returning to the market is actually just kind of like a new opening. It's not an arrival, really. And so really you could imagine like maybe you could write another 10 pictures of the journey that this old man goes through in his continual practice of insight and continual opening towards the world and other people. So that's kind of the Hegelian angle that I would take of this dialectical journey, where the absolute, the ending, this kind of be-all attainment of the man back in the market, is one, a product of a process, and that it's also a new opening. Those are kind of two core Hegelian insights for me.
So I really like that, and that speaks to me so deeply as well. Really resonates with me. I think it is important. Maybe it's like in a way, if you take it just as one, this is the narrative, like a vertical narrative. You start in the bottom of the mountain, and you're going upwards, and then you reach the peak, and then you're there. But I don't think that's the frame. the frame is not that you get there and then you're like in paradise or whatever. You're just there for all times. But there is a pattern there that is meaningful, I think, in the sense that something happens at the peak. And of course, that is something we should try to get into as well. Not only because it's really interesting, of course, and I think you are more into this than me. Maybe not, I don't know, but how to get others to be interested in the chase after the ox. But there's also, what is the ox? You know, what is this? What is this? You know, what is this hairs on? I have hairs on this skull, and I'm talking, uttering sounds out of my face hole, and I have work, and I have these 5 fingers, really strange fingers, and have you seen your toes? It's like, what is this? You know, there's something to be recognized, I think, like at first for me, and that is just that we don't really know what this is. We don't really know what it is, and if we use our best science and look into like the mobile phone I'm holding or whatever, and you go deep, you find like an eternity just on the physical level, you know. And you can go into the cellular and molecular and the atom and the quantum, and you can become a professor in just studying this phone, and you wouldn't know everything about it. There's a certain kind of inexhaustibility of everything, every object, but also just everything that all the objects, what we call objects, are part of. And it's incredible that we can even talk about this in a meaningful way, because I think now we are coming close to the limit of what is actually possible to talk logically about in a way. There has to be start to talk in contradictions or in paradoxes, in ways that point out of itself. And I find that exactly a way that point out of itself, that is in a way the pattern of going up the mountain, and then there's something out of itself, out of the journey, something that is crashing down, the crashing into his symbolic order of his universe, his way of viewing life or whatever. There's something in a way violent happening there. That is, yeah. What is that? What is that, and what is our relationship to it? I think the ox herder is kind of pointing us to that.
I think you were starting to point this out, and I think that the 10 pictures are trying to get at this too, but it really does feel like the mountain analogy is the problem, like it's a blocker to what's going on. Like, for instance, when you were talking, it made me think of the moment of Christ's transfiguration, where he takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain. They have the transfiguration, and Peter, being the sort of bold bumbler that he is, he decides, oh, let's make a tent so we can all hang out up here. He's sort of like, let's build a tent on the mountain. And Jesus is like, no, don't tell anybody what you saw. And then they go back down the mountain. And so Peter's kind of this like, let's camp at the top of the mountain. This is so amazing and mind-blowing. And Jesus is like, no, don't even tell people what you saw. Like, we're going to go back down the mountain. And there's this, in Zen, and I think in Hegel, there's this idea that the blocker for insight is this preconception about truth that we have, that it's somehow more abstract, that it's somehow more beyond, that like by getting beyond our experience somehow, that we're getting at what is more real than experience. And I think part of that is the mistake that we get wrapped up in.
Oh, I love this. Now you're really like kind of, we're getting into where our tension is kind of brewing and buzzing. the beyond word, and and I love that. I love it because in my epistemology there is also a meaningful way to talk about the beyond, and of course I use that word sometimes, but I do feel I agree with that. I agree with that in a way. I agree with that the more real isn't necessarily the more and more abstract in your thinking. And the Neoplatonic tradition, of course, that I have evoked a little bit, has an emphasis that can really it smells of that. It's like sometimes it's going up, up, up in the abstract, and there you find the forms, and that's the beyond, and something like that. But, and here's my question to you. Can I ask you a question? I think this it might be. I'm just throwing it into the water and seeing what happened, but maybe it can be a different angle into it. And it is the Lacanian Trinity. And you will have to help me a little bit. There's been a long time since I was in that. I was studying it. But of course, I really do. I like the thought of the real as a kind of function of the symbolic. So the real is not, oh, the real out there. Then if you're able to get more in touch with that real, then you are more in touch with reality. That is not how I don't think that's the meaning of that Trinity. For me, it seems like the real is produced, and of course, this is a point I got from Zizek, which I really like, and that is that the real, the light that shines through the cracks, is in a way a function of the cracks. How the real manifests itself, why it is terrifying, why it is something that can shock us, or it is because it escapes the categories. So that means that, and so it seems like you agree with me so far. I will come to the point where you won't agree with me, but hopefully it's not now. Great. Let's go on trying to catch the ox. It seems to me then that there would be different particular configurations of the Lacanian Trinity. Like you could call them, just to say something, in different parts of the world, different cultures with different thousands of years of different history and symbolic histories, etc. Different socialization processes and blah, blah, blah. So, and also, of course, the idiosyncrasies of the individual biography, traumas and stuff like that, perhaps would also contribute into the symbolic order that the real is kind of a function of. Do you agree with that?
Yes, that makes sense to me. Like the idea that, different cultures, their imaginary is kind of made up of a different set of symbols or stories, that their language has very different emphases in the way that it goes about alienating the subject. The way that you speak about yourself is very different in Japanese than it is in English, for instance. So I think that the historical particularities of what makes up one's experience of the symbolic, even if, one is a symbolic being, that kind of function is a core part. The historical instance is still important, I think. I don't know if Lacan would admit that. I haven't read him enough, but I agree with you.
Cool. So this is my question, and it might be that I misunderstand something, and that might definitely be, or that I just, yes, I really want to hear what you have to say about this. I'm exploring this at the moment, so my thoughts are not fully developed, but so that means that you have different configurations of the Lacanian Trinity. You might say different cultural configurations of them, or whatever you want to say, historical, symbolic, etc., in different places of the world. And then it comes to the beyond questions. Because how does these configurations come to be as they are? Is it totally random? Or is something constraining it? Are there constraints to it? So that is, I have a connection to something else, but that is the main question.
Well, I wonder if constraint already implies too much of a vision about the expected answer, because constraint is like an external actor upon something. I would almost argue that if there are constraints, they are better thought of as the unfolding of an internal limit of the system itself, that the limit is internal to the system, and that actually through the system's unfolding, it kind of is exploring its limits. So the better argument might be that yes, human beings are limited in that they have these certain structures that are inherent to their limitation, but we wouldn't necessarily call those constraints. They're more like, I try to kind of conceptualize them as, yes, they are limits, which do thereby constrain us, but they are also the condition of the possibility of our freedom and of our playing with those limits. As Hegel points out, to posit a limit is to already be beyond it. So there's this playing with limits that takes place. So does that kind of move your question forward a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. And it seems to me that maybe I could ask it in a little bit different way then, because I do agree with that. For me, every word that we use have come with baggage, or is that the expression? Every word that we use is limited and stinks, like we can only say half truths. So like, but we have to speak, or we like to speak. At least I like to speak. So I think for me it's a little bit like a pragmatics, or like there are other things too, but I find that the word constraints points to something that I think is meaningful to point to. And I do not have a hang-up on the word constraint. I can definitely use other words or other ways of pointing to it. But if a tradition came up that uses the word constraint, I think that I would be able to communicate with them. And of course, I could also develop a critique of the baggage that the language they are using is giving us, or the images. And I want to connect this with the word beyond too, because there are so many ways to talk about beyond. And I think I'm an atheist to a lot of those beyonds, But are there meaningful ways of using that word? And I think so. And here, it's not only pragmatics. Here, I feel like a little bit of a stance is coming. Because the word beyond, it is connected to a longer history in the Western civilizations in a way, as are the true, the good, the beautiful, etc. And also the biblical stories, the Neoplatonic, etc. And I find that I want to connect with the best of the old world. I'm really trying to do that. And I've busted myself being like an enlightenment thinker, almost thinking that everything worth reading and thinking about happened like after 1600s. And that was just my own ignorance, of course. And I've started reading the like older books, and a lot through religious studies, but also like the mystics or Saint Maximus or Gregory of Nyssa. I'm just blown away. These are really sophisticated thinkers using a language that can be thrown away too easily, I think. So I'm kind of pushing back a little bit. You can see that, right? I'm like yes, I agree with so much of that, and it's so important, like to push back on that language. It has been used in so many ways, and it has a kind of visual thing with it that it has traps. It's full of traps. But I also think that it can be powerful pointers to and guiding principles to think with on our way finding the ox.
I think what you're saying is complex and worth wrestling with. I think where I'm at, I'm still sort of an Enlightenment bigot, where I think that there was an actual step forward in human maturation in the kind of Kantian transcendental turn. And I think there is this in Hegel, especially and in the Hegelian tradition, that humanity does have achievements where they kind of achieve a new level of understanding, or a new concept comes into being that reorganizes all the other concepts in a fundamental way, and that you kind of can't go back. So I do think that the historical, I wouldn't call it progress. I would call it development. You can kind of see how ideas are unfolding and building on and critiquing each other over time in human history. And I do see kind of the older Platonic Aristotelian frameworks as immature from our perspective. And that's not to say that I'm smarter than Plato, Aristotle, Maximus. These guys were much more brilliant with me, but because of their social location, they were captured by a certain picture, which is how they had to express their insights, that their insights are valuable for us, but we have to figure out how to reinterpret, how to reenact for ourselves their insights, because I do think that they were captured by this picture, that I want to push back against the picture, because I think that the picture kind of belongs to an earlier stage of human development that we could be liable to fall back into and lose the good things that we have attained through working through that prior immature position. So the idea of returning to an already existent object, like the good as an existent thing that we're trying to get to and to access, that it is itself without relation to who we are. To me, that idea is a part of the older, more immature picture. Whereas I think that with German idealism, humanity finally starts to see this different picture of the absolute as itself not foreclosed on itself. The absolute is not absolute. The absolute is lacking, as Zizek has been trying to point out. I don't think that German idealism does away with beyond, but what it does is it demonstrates that every beyond is also just an opening up to a new beyond, and that process of tracking the ox is actually the production of whatever the destination happens to be. So it's a productive process that produces the good. The good is produced by the process, and basically, and here's the psychoanalytic insight, is that we are tricked into producing the good by the idea that we're seeking an already existent good. This is Lacan's point, is that human beings act on the basis of a felt loss, but that felt loss is an illusion that drives us forward to produce the very thing that we thought that we lost. And that, that's what Hegel calls the cunning of reason. Reason sort of tricks us into doing its bidding in history in this strange sort of way. So that was a lot, but I'm trying to get away from that older picture of returning to a fully formed object, and instead I'm trying to press into what I think is a better insight, which is this, that the process is the production of the very object we think we're seeking.
Yes, wow, yeah, that's a lot of stuff, and of course the thought of the immature, more immature, or that the ancient had to express themselves through their particular cultural situation or epoch. Of course, yes, I really agree with that, and also, of course, that you have to read them with a grain of salt. If you read those old books, you're like, oh man, this is so good, and then you turn the page and it's like, that was hard to to read. Sometimes you can just, but yes, and so that is heard, and I also agree with that. I guess my perspective right now, at least, is that in a lot of ways they were more mature than us, and in some ways we are more mature than them. And I think that also, if you look at, now I'm not going to go into the indigenous people, but also they too, it's like the thought that that I don't remember the tribe, but they calls us the little brother. Our civilization, if you could use that word, is a very new one. Like we are maybe in our adolescence or maybe younger or whatever, what is our real deep history, at least if we are talking about our enlightenment history. So my perspective is more like the enlightenment. Wow, yes, of course, there's so much good stuff there. I don't want to throw away also a lot of political stuff, like the democratic stuff and etc. And also a lot of the philosophical traditions. And I want to more deeply into, because as I've told you also, I have not studied Hegel a lot. That is what you can say a lack, in my thinking. It's more like I've connected to him indirectly through his critiques of him, and also through Marx. But yes, so I think my perspective is yes, I think so. There are certain ways that we definitely are more mature, but there are also definitely ways, I would argue, that they are much more mature than us, and that we are, in a way, a kind of 16, 17-year-old young guy doing don't want to be like your father and mother, and like throwing everything out with the bathwater, the baby out with the bathwater. It's like I feel some of that still, and I want to keep the baby. There's a baby in here, folks. We want to keep the baby. The bathwater can go. Yeah, let's drain it. No, but there's so much good there, and yes, I believe in kind of the wisdom of the elders to romanticize it a little bit. Yeah. So what do you say about that?
I really appreciate your spirit here, Jonatan, because to me, you're very much kind of like voice in the wilderness, kind of against the spirit of the age. Because I do think the Enlightenment spirit is this sort of like, we know better, we're smarter now, these poor benighted fools in the past. And for me personally, I'm a Christian, and so I'm connected to the family history of the church. And so to me, I have this inherent respect for those who came before me, of like, they followed Christ before me. They ran the race. Yes, they were sinners just like me. I can see their mistakes, but I can also see the things where I wish I could be like them too. And so because I'm connected to that history in a very visceral way, I can see it in all of its black, white, and gray as well, and see how somebody is such a messy and complex person, and how I want to be like them in some ways, and then they've got these massive blind spots that don't make any sense to me because of my position.
Yes.
But I realize that 100 years from now, somebody's going to look at Matt and be like, Matt, you had this massive blind spot, And so I think that perspective is really hard to cultivate and to maintain. So it needs to be insisted on consistently in the way that you're insisting on. So I think my question, to throw back to you, and I think you can enlighten me and the listener on this, is what are some areas of maturity that you think the ancients demonstrate for us? What are some things of value that they are trying to offer us in our moment?
Ooh, yes. I love that question. Let me be silent with it a little bit and see what pops up here. One thing, I think it's the ancient cosmologies. I think they were really connected to a kind of symbolic network that is a language of reality, or something like that. And I think we have, in a way, lost touch with that language of reality. At least my culture in Norway has. So just to have one example there, for example, like the old, I think that the myths. So I'm going into the myth scape now. Let's say like this. Of course, this is a hypothesis. This is a statement. Let's explore it. I'm kind of convinced of it. I think it's powerful. It is that the myths have developed. They have gone through a kind of a natural selection or an evolution, maybe for thousands of years. You know, these are a part of the oral traditions often. So there are a lot of different stories. Some of the stories last for hundreds of years, some 160 years, and some are just that one night over that bear and will never be told again, you know? But there are some that have been condensed and reified through being told from father, mother, whatever, over the fireplace or at bed again and again and again and again. So what are these stories? What are the symbolism or the patterns that seems to be so relevant that they are recapitulated and told again and again and again after all of these years? So that was one of the things. I think that is a really powerful way of exploring reality, the symbolism. So that is one thing. I don't know if that was a good answer, but because it's difficult, it's always really difficult to explain the power of the kind of the power of symbolism. If you haven't dug into it a little bit, you know, but I'm sure you have.
Yeah, I think that there's a deep skepticism about symbols and stories in our culture, and I definitely participate in it. I think that it's Lacan's imaginary has all of these traps, and it's a big reason why he spends so much time working on building out the idea of the imaginary in the way that pictures kind of obscure their own lack and obscure the subject's position in the story. And then we've got just everybody's so afraid of ideology now. And I think part of that is the 20th century showed us what ideology can do to people, that it can, ideology can help people pull the lever to gas Jews, and it can help people feel nothing when they sign away entire people's lives, consigning them to the gulags. And we've seen the power of ideology in the 20th century, and I think that it has left us traumatized by stories, because great evil requires a great story to make it palatable, and so I think we've become really afraid of the power of stories. But I agree with you that we don't want to lose that mode of thinking, because I do think it's a form of thinking. I think that the universe is kind of this massively networked thinking thing that does not exclusively think in scientific terms. Like the way that scientists approach the articulation of a problem, the testing of a hypothesis, that process is one historically specific mode of thinking. And I think that the universe thinks in more ways than that, and that we are part of that networked computer. So I was talking with a colleague of mine yesterday. He's been doing some really interesting work on field theory in psychoanalysis, and he was making his case to me that what's happening in a psychoanalytic session between the analyst and the analysand is that they are actually forming a brain. He's a neuropsychologist, and he's saying all you need for thought to happen is two nodes and a contact barrier between those nodes. So you've got two neurons, and you have some form of a contact barrier through which waves are able to communicate between the two nodes. That's the fundamental unit of thinking. And then, of course, the brain has billions of these connections. But in the analytic session, you have two nodes, the analyst and the analysand, and you have a contact barrier, which is language, speech. And what happens is that these two create a thinking thing. There's a third thing that starts to emerge in the conversation. In fact, we're forming a thinking thing right here, right now. And you can imagine going back to around the campfire. There's a bunch of warriors sitting around the campfire at night, and there's 3, 4, 5 of them, and they're telling a story. That's a computer. That is a network thinking thing that is processing reality in a way that is different from a scientific mode or of an enlightenment mode. It's doing so through symbol and story, which has its own logic
Yes.
to how it explores things and works things through.
Yeah, I love that. And when you were talking about the two nodes, I was Tyson Yunkaporta. I don't know if you have had him on the radar, but he's an Aboriginal thinker and just an awesome dude, has a great book called Sand Talk. Done a lot of work with complexity theory, but also connected to the Aboriginal societies there. And he is talking about like discussions like we have right now, dialogues, not between two individuals, maybe, which sounds more, I don't know, enlightenment or romantic tradition out, you have the two not so great people or great people talking together here, but he's actually more talking about it as yarning. And that is a net, right? So I am actually a node. I am kind of just letting my network of conversations and history of conversation and books that I read and everything kind of talk through me. I don't know what I'm saying now. I don't know what I will say next. I'm kind of listening to it at the same time, So where is all of this blabbering coming from? So I kind of feel like a channel. I'm kind of opening of a channel and things are kind of bursting out here, And I really like that. It's like the indra's net in a ways, like the Buddhist, isn't it the Buddhist conception of the indra's net, where spider net with a lot of rain or drops distributed around the spider's net, and you can see all of the net's droplets through the one droplet. And I kind of find that is what we are doing now in a way. I am that one droplet, and hopefully I'm letting the relevant things through me and create this third entity that you're talking about. Computer, you called it. That is a word that I also comes with a lot of baggage, and I have a little bit of a, it's a machine. Yes. Okay. I of course, there are a lot of advantages for that conceptualizations. You could also say it's a spirit, and that every conversations have a spirit. And I think that is more in line with the ancient cosmologies. And of course, that has also a lot of baggage, but I tend to like that.
Yeah, I think that computer has more potential in it than people give it credit for, though, because you can think about a network as just a way of transferring energy, And to me, that's really interesting. Like that kind of has almost that's this strange borderland between spirit and the mechanistic world, because the transfer of energy is very mysterious. Like we've got one thing that this colleague who I was referencing, he and I really want to work on is trying to establish whether brain entrainment takes place during an analytic session. And brain entrainment is just this crazy phenomenon that we do not understand. We do not know how people's brain waves sync up across space. And yet somehow there's a way that this happens. And so it seems to me like the movement and transfer of energy through a network, like it's funny, Freud originally kind of thought of the brain this way as like a series of circuits for moving energy around. I think there's a lot of work to be done on understanding how energy moves around, because I think that we don't get that at all. Like we really don't understand it. And I think that it's somewhere on this borderland with spirit and mechanistic views. But I wanted to just acknowledge briefly that, going back to what you were saying about being a node in a network and not really even knowing where your next words were going to come from. I think what Lacan and the Hegelian tradition are really trying to rescue from that.
So,
because they're deeply concerned about that being, therefore I'm totally determined and have no free will, and I'm just kind of like the unfolding of this bigger thing. They are really concerned about that. What they want to try to articulate is how, even if that's true, even if there's this robust unconscious that's operating through you, and that you ultimately you won't even be able to understand the full import of your own actions, they're trying to figure out how can we nonetheless articulate what the subject uniquely adds to that moment of becoming. Like, what is the fact that Jonatan is speaking these words add to the whole picture? What does the subject, Jonatan, add by his act of speaking? And I think that what Lacan, I think Zizek is getting at this too, is the subject is this kind of crack or joint in the discourse where it can kind of go different ways, where there's actually an opportunity as the unconscious is kind of working itself out. It has to articulate itself through the subject, and the subject is non-totalizable. The subject is, in a very real sense, indeterminate. And so the subject has this opportunity to decide to go different directions with things, or it could take one thing and it's got multiple ways it could take it, but it goes this direction. How does the fact that it chose this way change the whole picture? And so not only can you see the whole picture through the individual, but that the individual is also an ineliminable part of the picture that can actually, it can change the whole picture through its unique contribution. Is that making sense?
And I think it's really important, because if we move too much into you are a product of whatever you are, what can I say? Whatever you are in, you're a product of your culture, product of the networks, the old conversations, etc. There's a concern. Then where is freedom? And is everything just determined? And it's how it smells like that in a way, I think. So I do like your kind of pushing back on that dimension of it. For me, it is mysteriously both, right? I agree with you because the subject is also, of course, important. I remember Bob Dylan, he got a prize for some kind of life achievement prize or something. And everybody was looking at him as this genius, almost like he popped up out of a vacuum, like an enlightenment dream, like the great individual. But when he had his speech, he was just talking about other people. He was just talking about other people. He said that if you had been playing the songs that I was playing so many times as I had played them, you would have written Mr. Tambourine Man as well. So he is pointing to the things that is flowing through him. And of course, that is modest. And he is also important, I think, to appreciate the unique moment that the subject is. And like, I can say stuff, I can be wrong in ways that only I can be wrong. The way I am wrong can be very particular to me, at least the way I form it, the way I express it. So I think it's really important to not create a false dichotomy here, but to kind of not take we have to use words when we are having this communication, and then we are kind of, I feel like we are kind of experiencing how language itself traps itself into these categorical dichotomies, and suddenly you feel like you're too much in one direction, and then you have to say the opposite, and then you have this kind of a balancing act here going on, maybe. But I totally agree with that, and I think it's very important that you push back on it.
This conversation is making me realize kind of where this impulse to push back against the older forms, Platonic, essentialist ways of thinking, and it makes me think about how we're really sensitive to being suckered into committing acts of evil. I think that we find ourselves in a situation where our world feels so out of control, and that our life is made of these massive structures that are just kind of this grinding machines of cruelty. And we feel like everything we do is somehow participating in some immense cosmic cruelty. Like, I imagine in the older days, ethical decisions were, I wouldn't say ethical decisions are clear, but I would say that they're probably more like distinct events. Like you have the choice to kill X person on the battlefield or not. Or you have the choice to steal from so and so, or you have the choice to give your last piece of bread to this person. These are sort of like concrete ethical moments. But if you are a peasant who lives on some French lord's land somewhere and you just work the land, you go to church, you have your family, like you're not participating in some immense machine that is just churning out human suffering. You are a part of kind of what we now call feudalism, but that was even so patchwork that we can't call it a system. But today we've got a massive bureaucratic apparatus in every country that then rolls up into a larger bureaucratic apparatus like EU, NATO, UN, the World Health Organization, the World Bank. All of these massive apparatuses roll up into these bureaucratic machines that run regardless of who's in charge of them. There's policies and practices that just work. And I think that we all have this sense that we're implicated in these machines that we can't control.
Yeah.
But this, to me, I think motivates my desire to be aware of my own freedom, to try to find the little room I have to try to pivot with what little agency I do possess. And so I do think that, to maybe throw this back to you, see what you think. I wonder if the problem of our time is discovering genuine agency and how to practice it.
Yeah, wow, yeah, I think you're really pointing at something here. And just first to appreciate or acknowledge, recognize the rage against the machine, or we have all blood on our hands. It feels like it, and it's true. We are participating in a machine that, like, who made my T-shirt? What am I investing in? It's very, very difficult to be maybe naively, it's very difficult to be good. And I do, of course, have a wish to be that, but it's very difficult. It's easier to kind of ignore or to look away or to distract. And I think that is also a symptom or part of this whole thing that you are pointing to. Maybe that we're in an age of the carnival. We're in an age where the Colosseum is built. It's like entertainment. Let's distract ourselves, in a way, from the real problems, maybe. And yeah, how do you find agency in that? And for me, that is really important for me too. And I have to say that part of the way I find that the articulation of perhaps maybe a kind of agency is through participation. And now I come with more beyond words here, Matthew. Participate in the good, the true, etc. That is one way that for me articulates clear schema. I can wake up tomorrow and the room is just totally destroyed and everything is in pieces, and like, where do I start? This is too much. I can't fix everything of this at once, but I can move one thing. I can do my part in a way. For me, I guess the mission to try to move your little part in your little corner in a way that participates in the good. And for me, the good is, I was asking a little bit earlier in the conversation, that outside of the trinity of the real and the symbolic and the imaginary, we might be able to talk about some constraints. And of course, the word constraint, you were saying that there's some baggage with it, and you would say it in a different way, but maybe that it is pointing to something. And for me, the conceptualization of the true, good, and beautiful, they are ancient, non-propositional, participatory conceptualizations of the constraints which structure particular configurations of the real, imaginary, and symbolic. The true, the good, and beautiful are, in a way, inexhaustible. They are anti-essentialist. They are a kind of nothingness that is calling us. They are not the highest, but they are a meaningful schema to navigate in a world that is kind of flooded and with information and everything, chaotic. And I think we are living in an age, I think I'm doing a speech now. I'm going to end this speech before I start a political party here. But I do think that in an age where presidents lie openly, we're kind of, postmodernism is not over in a way. And the bad side of postmodernism, I like a lot of the postmodernists. But the bad side, the caricature, the anti-truth, I don't know. I think we need truth. We need to believe in truth. And now I'm not talking about the philosophers. I'm going back to the question you asked all the way at start with the ox herder. How do you make them or help people induce a kind of participation in the chase? I'm a teacher. I'm talking about my students. And I think they do not need more deconstruction, at least where they are. They need that, of course, after a while. It's very important. But we also need, I think, to fight for the concepts of true and the good. And yeah, I don't know what happened here. I guess I'm preaching or something now. Hopefully it made a little bit sense.
I agree with you about what younger people need. I keep coming back to this insight, and I think it was maybe my third episode of Samsara Audio, but I spoke with Gabe at Vivid Void on Twitter, and he told me just this anecdote that he was introduced to emptiness too soon, is what he said. He talked about going to college, being an English major, studying literature, and all he got was deconstruction at a time in his life when he needed to be constructing something, anything, because there was no, like, he wasn't even a thing to deconstruct yet. And it was like the being introduced to emptiness screwed him up for a decade. Basically, he had to work through that process. And I think that, you know, you're talking about the good, the true, and the beautiful as this calling. I can resonate with the idea of calling if we qualify that whatever is calling is not a thing. It's actually just the calling itself. The calling is the inducement to produce the thing that we think is calling us. But the experience of it as a calling, I think, is interesting. But I also think that at a certain point that calling does need to it does fall away at a certain point in the ox herding photos. Like, in the pictures, there's a point at which, after the man leads the ox home, the next picture is the man without the ox. The ox is off somewhere else, but he's not concerned about the fact that it's not next to him. And that is almost this moment where the calling doesn't seem to have such a grip on him anymore.
Yes.
And, you know, then the next photo is that photo of it's just a circle. And that's kind of the deconstructive move.
Yes.
Like, once the calling leads us to the ox, we catch the ox, we realize the ox wasn't really what we were trying to catch. And that calling starts to kind of lose its kind of visceral feeling over us. And then the deconstructive moment comes, and that deconstructive moment throws us back into nature and back into community.
Yes,
So it makes me think that what the ox herding photos are trying to get at then is that the ox is an idea of truth. And then there's truth, which is only truth is just the completion of the whole project, of the whole arc of the 10 pictures. And part of that arc is letting go of some sort of idea of truth that was calling us or holding us captive. Now I'm kind of mixing metaphors here, but I'm curious, how do we parse these things apart?
I'm also hearing a resonance with the Chichekian interpretation of the resurrection of Christ, which I find really interesting. But not to go into that at this moment, I think I totally agree, with the fact that the calling, it kind of dies away. Like there's something that's drawing you, okay. And then this violent nothingness, radical negation or whatever, like you could use these abstract terms. What are we pointing to? Happens. And then you have the return. So there, this really deconstruction, the chaos is happening. And then you have nothingness. And then you have a kind of humble return into the ordinariness, the radical ordinariness, maybe, where we can think with Nishida. And I would add into a new calling, because the calling is not only that which dies on the mountain. The calling is also, it is resurrected in a new way, I think. And for me, it is the spiral. So to say it in a different way, when the ox herder returns to town, soon he will start climbing the mountain again. So it is a kind of a spiral. I like the idea of the spiral, the William Blake image of Jacob's ladder. I like the spiral where you come back to the same place but on a level above it, and again and again and again. There's a kind of development there. I like that image. What do you think about that? That the calling also returns, though in a new way.
I think that's true, and I think that I'm going to take a risk here and say that maybe there's a sense in which Christianity does this a little better than Buddhism does, I think. There is kind of this tradition in Buddhism of the Bodhisattva who has this self-binding vow in order to bring all other creatures to enlightenment. So there is this, like, through the achievement of enlightenment, one can then reach a place where now they can be wholly poured out for the other. But I do think that Christianity does this a little better, where there's this continual calling to take up one's cross, to engage in repentance. I think this act of repentance, this turning away, is the kind of structure of this cycle of death and rebirth. And that cycle is kind of built into the core of the act of Christian discipleship, constantly dying to self and something new being born in you. But that's only done through continual engagement with the community, with others, with yourself, through constant working on yourself, and all of that bathed in grace. All of that supported by the Spirit of God, who is the one who's working in you. You know, something else is kind of coming to fruition in you. That's the Spirit of God. And so I think there's more rich resources here for thinking about kind of the ethical life. Whereas I find that I think Buddhism is really good in my experience at being able to see, it helps see the emptiness. And it also has some pretty rigorous practices around discipline of the self. But I think, as I'm kind of saying, I think Christianity has a richer symbolism and categories and practice of engagement with others in, like, ethical living, I think.
Yes, although yes, you took a risk. I also am a little bit scared of comparing them too much, because I have to say that what is Buddhism? It's so much, Christianity, there are so many different Christianities, and I definitely don't have a good overview over all of them, or some of them, but I have to admit as well, if I can take a risk with you, because I want to do that, step with you into that risk, to say that at least from my perspective, yes, Christianity has the symbolism in the narratives is an offering that I can't see. I can't see it in Buddhism in the same way. I also see suffering, of course, it's very important in Buddhism as well, but that seems to me, and this might be my ignorance as well, but that the picking up of the cross, that suffering is kind of in the middle of it's around your neck. It's the cross, right? It is just, you can't look away from it in a way. The suffering is part of, not only part of life, but it's the way in a way. It's enlightenment in some of the Buddhist circles that I've been in touch with or connected with, and this might very well be very westernized Buddhism, and not really representative. The enlightenment feels very soft and light and peaceful, and like, where is the suffering and the horror? And I find that the horrific dimension of the awe-inspiring is much more present in, at least how I see it, in Christianity than I've seen in Buddhism. But in our age, and that might be our particular situation, I also fully agree that it's much more difficult to see the emptiness through the Christian tradition than in the Buddhist tradition. It is a much easier, accessible way to that insight, I think, through Buddhism than Christianity.
To compare them again, maybe a way to look at it would be that Buddhism is really good at helping you see where the suffering in your life is unnecessary, like where there is excessive suffering that is producing like a lot of friction, but not a lot of value. Whereas I think Christianity is very focused on how do you put suffering to work? How do you put it to work in your life? As opposed to seeing it as something to run away from and as something to try to eliminate. Whereas I think Buddhism comes across as like, our goal is to eliminate suffering. And when they put in the qualifications, like you talk to a Buddhist, the Buddhist says, well, I'm trying to they'll qualify it and say, yes, there's no way to get rid of suffering, but what we're trying to do is to get rid of the unnecessary suffering, the suffering that is layered on top of just struggle. And I think that qualification doesn't come up enough. And so, the Christian may be liable to introduce excessive and unnecessary amounts of suffering to their lives.
Fetishizing it.
I think that that's absolutely a Christian tendency. Yes, as you said, a fetishizing of suffering. Christianity, for that reason, I think has a more robust emphasis on taking that suffering and doing something with it, mobilizing it in your life for change and for the benefit of others, and seeing it as something productive. Like struggle is kind of the loam out of which good things grow.
Yes, and the basic model of the human being, like Cornel West says, we're two-legged, featherless, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces, who will one day undeniably be the culinary delights of terrestrial worms, beings toward death. Like the catastrophe of life, the death and the sickness. It is part of life. It is to be expected, and sadness is part of life. I think that, what is the English word for it? The mourning. I think mourning is one of the most important things that you can become good at as a human being, because there's a lot of suffering in small and big ways throughout life. And then the response to the tragedy, not that it is to give up, but not to just distract yourself from it or flee from it as well. It's a kind of to be able to stand in it or be with it and still move on, still continue in a way, at least in a small way that you can carry that one thing from A to B and leave the room a little bit more tidier than that it was. I really love that model of our predicament, I guess, that I find in Christianity.
I selfishly want to add something that I read recently, because I'll just see what this adds to the conversation. I think it's hearkening back to the call of truth that we were talking about earlier. I just finished a book reading about the history of the idea of toleration, basically as it developed in Northern Europe. How can people of different religions live together without killing each other? And it's fascinating that it took like 200 years from Martin Luther to Roger Williams' founding of Providence, Rhode Island. And I think I'm so fascinated by the creation of this idea that one could live with people of other religions in peace, and how it was such a bloody history to arrive at that ability to be able to think that way and live that way. But at the same time, that idea didn't arise in other places because it seems like there's something unique about Christianity specifically that has this impulse towards truth. For instance, like if you're a Confucian, you don't kill Buddhists. Like you just do a synthesis, you know? Now, obviously there has been religious war in other parts of the world. And even Islam has this mechanism of allowing Christians and Jews to live in Islamic societies if they pay the tax, they don't proselytize. There are sort of other models of religious coexistence, but toleration came about in a context where all of these different groups had a strong impulse to believe that there is a truth and that they knew it. The idea of toleration is not as useful in a context where there's a bunch of religions and they're all like, oh yeah, you sort of believe the same thing as we do basically, or, you know, we're all just grabbing different parts of the elephant, or my religion is just sort of like something I believe and you've got a different God over the hill and that God rules that valley, whatever, you know, like you should worship them, I'll worship mine. Toleration doesn't make sense in a context where there's not that strong, where that calling to truth is not felt strongly. And so it seems like there's actually something fairly unique about the kind of Germanic Anglo-Saxon view of truth, such that simultaneously, like, you know, the Protestant experience of, hey, you Catholics are totally wrong, and the church cannot impinge on people's consciences to tell them what they have to believe. Only the individual conscience and scripture and reason are the, like, that private experience is the foundation of belief and truth. The vision of truth that developed in that context is very unique. And that's why it was so difficult for toleration to come about. And yet toleration did come about in that context. It didn't come about in Roman Catholic context. It was Protestants who developed religious toleration for Catholics when Catholics would not tolerate Protestants in their countries. So there's also something unique about the Protestant vision of truth such that it could develop religious tolerance. This is my long lecture based on a book that I just read. But these are the questions that are coming out for me of like, what is this vision of truth that is different such that people would think that they needed to kill for it? And yet also there is the sense in which through working with that truth idea long enough, they arrived at a different conclusion, which is actually the truth compels us to create room for other people who don't believe the same truth as us.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And of course, it's part of me that is like a little bit of a hippie. I want there to be room for all of the different ways up the mountain, you know. I think also, like even Nishida says somewhere that I don't know, that the kind of source or there is something perennial in the different religions, of course. And now I'm evoking the word perennialism. I mean, I have my own critique of that. There's a lot to be said about that. It's important to respect the different particularities, etc., and that there are differences and important ones. But it's very important for me that the conceptualization of truth is not a one that makes me the one that has all of it and see it as it really is, and everyone else has some kind of lesser part of it, like the ethnocentric truth. Truth is something, and now I'm evoking another friend of us, the word beyond. The truth is something beyond my specific, particular configuration of it. I am reaching for something beyond, like I am when I'm asking a question. What is truth? I can ask that question and I kind of sense into a field which is reaching beyond the horizon of my own knowledge. There is a part of asking a question, I think, that is also that imply nothingness or to imply standing in front of the unknown and something beyond, something that can be called beyond my current horizon. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense to you.
Yeah, I think this confrontation with limit, this limit experience, I think is really crucial
Yes.
to figure out kind of what's going on here. And I think it's I do think that's the debate, is that like Hegel and Lacan have a very precise theory of what's happening in that limit experience, which is that the perception of a beyond is being created by the existence of the limit.
Yes.
And that it's that perception of the beyond which is what creates that call and the exercise of attempting to work through and overcome that limit. And so they're going to resist any sort of substantialist theory of like that there is this beyond that you are trying to get at or access. Because, you know, the argument the other way goes, like, what would a beyond that cannot be expressed be? Like, how could it in any meaningful sense be? Like, even, what was it? Was it Meister Eckhart basically talks about God becoming God by entering into being? Even the idea of God as like ground, like God is the ground of being, means that he's not being. What we're doing is we're just like spinning these paradoxical words to try to describe an edge of something that cannot be spoken about. And so the question is what can't be spoken about a thing? In which case, theoretically, it should be able to be spoken about. Or is the point not that there is a thing beyond the limit, but rather that the playing with the limits is the point? The playing with the limits is what we're doing. And the playing with the limits has this side effect of producing the effect of a beyond. And when we get distracted by and like, like shiny, like we want the beyond that was created, we miss what we're actually doing, which is we're playing with the limits.
Yes, it's a lot of things that is popping up for me here. First and foremost, of course, I'm not a thingist. I don't think that that which is beyond a thing. I think that which is beyond that phrase, it's a metaphor. It's like we are small human beings. Like what we know is just outside of our house. We can see a border there. We can see like a fence. Oh, or we can see the horizon. I can't see past it, but there's something there. And a little bit in the same way, we are talking about the field of truth in a way that I have a certain connection to the world around me, to certain information of it that is relevant, that I am configured into. The world has kind of collapsed, or whatever is out there, it has kind of collapsed into a path that I can navigate. And you don't need to go all the way to the fundamental ontology in a way to talk about it. You can talk about the socialization process. And I think if you look at small kids, I know that you have one or two, but they can pick up a toothbrush and it's a plane and and they're moving it around and playing with it. And then the adult comes to say, no, that is a toothbrush and you should just use it in this and this fashion at certain hours of the day. It is not a toy, it's not a plane. And the child kind of, okay, and collapses into a certain thing. But it doesn't mean that the toothbrush has been objectified but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have more possibilities than that, and that the possibilities in a way is inexhaustible. Now I'm back to that point. So that is one thing. A different thing is that, yes, this beyond that we can't speak about, it's definitely true that we can't speak about it like in logical terms to be understood with our kind of propositional knowing, intellectual, theoretical mind. But is that the point? So when we are talking about stuff like truth, is the point really to understand it intellectually? Or are we, and I would say, we should rather, and I'm getting normative here, I guess, at least a different perspective, a different avenue into it, angle into it would be what is helping us participate in it better. Because you could talk about it with Lacanian language, and which I love it, and is learning more about it. Right now I'm half through Zizek's new book, for example, which I really love. But I think that is not participatory language, would be my claim. I think maybe we should have a participatory language about these things that actually help us navigate in life in the radical ordinariness. Not that necessarily satisfy our categorical, theoretical mind, but that helps us participate more optimally every day. So a participatory conceptualization of truth, not a propositional, I would argue for. And then it might be not so necessary to find a propositional, clear understanding of it. It might even be paradoxical, or it's like Whitman's poem, "Do I contradict myself? Well, then I contradict myself. I am vast. I contain multitudes." And I feel the truth is like that.
Jonatan, I think that you have helped me kind of see where some of the battle is, and I think that it has to do with differing metaphors. Like the metaphor of truth as a horizon or as a beyond, and as participating into that, I am, for some pathological reason, allergic to this. And I think that what you've argued is that, like, this metaphor should not be abandoned and that it needs to be tarried with. Whereas I would kind of go more of the metaphor of process and production as opposed to participation. I think that you have convinced me that this metaphor should not be abandoned wholesale, that it should be ransacked for its value, and that work needs to come from a place of humility about our own historical and cultural location. I think that that's what I'm taking away from this conversation, along with, many other things, but kind of as a core insight, that's what it's leaving me with.
Yeah, let's turn the couch around and see if some coins falls out, I think that we haven't checked under the pillows of these concepts. There might be some coins there as well that we can buy beer with or whatever. I thank you, Matthew, for a great conversation. It really helped me it's really good to think with you. And I was right. There was a creative tension here, at least for me. I understand for you as well. Wonderful. It was worthwhile, and I will have to digest this conversation now for many days. So I'm looking forward to keep on engaging with you. And I hope that this conversation, I think for me, I have kind of gotten a clearer image or understanding of where you are coming from. So that will help me to connect better, hopefully, in the Nishida calls that is coming. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a treat. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I'm looking forward to more insights and more conversation in our Kyoto School reading group, which I would just encourage folks, if you want to find out more how to join us reading Nishida's An Inquiry into the Good, we'd love to have you. I'll drop some details into the show notes. Jonatan, I just want to be the first one to push you and say, I know you're a busy man with a wonderful job teaching young folks and DJing. like a cool guy. But I would like to be the first one to encourage you. I hope you would write down and share your thoughts, either on a video or through words. I hope that you would find some way to share your ideas and thoughts with others, because I think that they're valuable. I think that you're a good thinker. I think that you're articulate. And, whenever the time is right, I know all about the battle of finding time, of why am I doing this, that sort of thing. But if you feel led to share, I would like to read what you have to say. I would like to share it with others. And if there's any sort of fear holding you back, I don't know if it's fear or if it's just, hey, that is not my calling right now, which that is something I can totally respect. So anyways, I'm going on. That's my short way of encouraging you to share your ideas with others if you feel led.
Thank you so much. That hit home. Really appreciate that, man. And you are definitely inspiring me, when I can see that it's possible to be a family man and produce as much as you are doing, and the quality that you are producing. That is really inspiring. And it has actually got me back to the writing process. And it's been a couple of years now that I haven't written too much, but it seems like I am kind of, gliding in that direction a little bit now. And I really appreciate your good words there to me. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, hearing that makes it all worth it, because that's the sort of impact that I would want to have in somebody's life. Not, oh, here's how you should think. That is definitely, I think I wrote a piece about this last year of I can't tell you what to think, basically. So if you feel inspired to write more and develop your own thoughts, then that is all I can have. And I'm really thankful that I've been able to help you in that respect. Thank you for listening to Samsara Audio, everyone. Jonatan, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's a little later for you. You probably have to jet and go somewhere, but I've really appreciated this, and I look forward to all our future conversations.
All the best.